brief introduction by Jen Cook, my co-coordinator, we're coordinating together, and task force members, and then we will start our discussion on grounded theory by Dr. Donna Gibson and Dr. Colette Dollarhide. So that will be an overview of our time, and then a brief wrap up after close to when we're a 1 hour mark or so. So to jump in, Jen, would you like to introduce yourself and the task force members?
Absolutely. I'm Jen Cook. I'm assistant professor at Marquette University and co-chair with Emily for CEQUIN for this year. And we are really happy and excited to introduce you all to our new task force leadership who have been tasked with working with some important items related to CEQUIN's work with the counselor ed and supervision community. And we're happy to have 3 of them with us today out of 4. They're going to just do a quick introduction of who they are and what their task force is about, and they will also give their contact information in the chat. So if you want to get involved with the task force, feel free to reach out to one of these folks today. So our first person I'd like to introduce and have her take the mic is Maddie Clark. She's assistant professor at University of Toledo, and she is working with the research and publication, well, she's leading, the research and publication task force.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jen. As she said, I am the chair of the Research and Publication Task Force, and what we have actually recently completed, but we're not totally done with edits yet, is a report of how our 22 ACA and divisional journals have publication standards and how they address page limits and things like that, specifically for qualitative manuscripts. And we also included the professional counselor, JCLA, and the clinical supervisor in that list. So we've taken all of these publication standards and are now kind of getting a baseline to see where our field is, and then we're going to kind of go from there. This works hand in hand. Dr. David Kleist at Idaho State is working on a similar practice with what do major qualitative journals suggest for publication guidelines, so we're going to kind of compare and contrast both of those documents once we're finished. I think that's all we've got. I'll put my email in the chat.
Perfect, Maddie. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Amy Barth, who is assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and she is chairing the Professional Development and Continuing Education Task Force. Amy.
Thank you, Jen. So our first meeting will be March 5th at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. We haven't met yet, so we're just getting that going. So anyone who would like to jump in on professional development ideas or continuing ed, please feel free. I'll put my information down below. We would like to continue some of the great work that the CEQUIN has already started with the webinars and other training opportunities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Amy. And today, representing the Technology and Communications Task Force is Phil Walk. Did I say that correctly, Phil? Uh-oh, his lips are moving and his voice is not coming through. I think maybe you're muted, Phil.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Did I say your last name correctly?
It's Walkus. It's like walk and kiss.
Oh, Walkus, thank you. And Phil is assistant professor at University of South Dakota, and he's actually joined with a co-chair, and Dr. Annette Bax at Rutgers University. Phil, would you tell us a little bit about the Technology and Communications Task Force?
Sure, we're working on a couple of different things. At the moment, we're looking at getting started again a Facebook group we had quite a few years ago to have like ongoing discussion of qualitative issues in places that are accessible. We're also looking at cleaning up the website and a number of different resources there, and finding a new platform for the webinars. We're looking at the new platform and being recording also.
Great, thanks, Phil. Oh, sorry, you're not finished. This is the problem with webinars.
I'm going to put my email in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And the person who is chairing our teaching task force, she's unable to be with us today. That's Dr. Heather Dahl, who is at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I'm going to go ahead and put her information in the chat for you, but this task force is working on best practices in teaching qualitative research, both at the master's and doctoral level. They're going to be working on developing resources for teaching and communicating with educators and other stakeholders in terms of teaching. So I will put Heather's information into the chat and go ahead and turn it back over to Emily to introduce our speakers for today.
Can I add, this is Jen and I, this is our second year co-coordinating CEQUIN, and we just got these task forces up and running. We got interest this past fall, and we've had just terrific energy and volunteerism around that. So we're really excited to get that off the ground, and we've had such robust turnout. So thank you again to our task force leaders, and again, for those of you who are joining us, if you are interested in joining a task force and helping with some of these areas, please see the emails below. And also another note, we are recording this session. And with that note, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers for today. We have Drs. Gibson and Dollarhide, who are discussing grounded theory with us today, and they'll have a good, probably near 40 minutes to discuss this PowerPoint, and they'll be going back and forth with each other, and I will let them introduce themselves further, but again, I'm very grateful for them volunteering their time and their expertise with us, and I'm personally looking forward to learning more about grounded theory from them as well. So, so please jump in and let us know if you need anything. We'll be here.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jen and Emily, for inviting us to talk about one of our favorite things, and that's grounded theory. I'm Donna Gibson, and just a little bit, so we'll just introduce ourselves just a little bit because we have a lot of information to share. I'm actually a professor of counselor education at Virginia Commonwealth University and currently the department chair for our department, which is counseling and special education. I believe I am completing my 18th year as a counselor educator and have been doing a lot of qualitative research for probably the last decade or so, more so than quantitative.
And I'm Colette Dollarhide. I'm a professor at Ohio State University. I've been doing this now about 25 years. I've been a counselor for 30 and currently involved with Counselors for Social Justice and very excited to be here. Thank you, Emily and Jen, for inviting us.
So we're just going to jump right into it, and I believe you're going to receive the PowerPoint as a handout, and if you can't read it when you get it, just reach out to us and we can provide you an electronic copy of it so you can see it a little bit bigger if you can't see it from what they send you. I believe Colette is going to share our outline for the rest of the presentation.
One of the things that we know is that conversations about grounded theory is a little challenging in 40 minutes, and so we're going to be moving kind of fast, talking about deconstructing a study that we conducted and using the perspectives of grounded theory in order to help illustrate what grounded theory looks like, both in practice and in theory. We realize that there is a lot to this, and we hope that we'll get through the basics of grounded theory, conducting a grounded theory study. We hope at the end of the conversation that we'll have a little bit of time to talk about software and reporting and publishing, but we'll have to, I think, focus more on the constructs than, and if we miss some of it, you have the handouts.
Like we said, this is a taste of it, and so I think a lot of people hear about grounded theory and as part of the qualitative methods and not quite sure what that's about. It's one of the major ones we do see published. We see a lot of phenomenology, and I believe you already had a webinar on that. And we also see grounded theory as one that shows that there are differences between the two. And so when you think about doing a grounded theory study, you really have to think about, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? And Colette's going to talk about research questions in a little bit, but so this method, really, the intention of the method is to explain a phenomenon, not describe it. So when you think about phenomenology, you're describing an experience that people have had and that people that have been around the phenomenon have had. But you really, with grounded theory, you're talking about how do you explain that phenomenon that's being studied from the perspective and in the context of those who have experienced it. So you may have a phenomenon that is specific to lots of people, but it could be the context that makes it different for those people. And so you may have a context of a certain group that you're looking at explaining something of that phenomenon, and you have a different group within a different context. And so you have to think about that carefully. Some people I see a lot, and I pull a lot of what I see from my time as an associate editor of qualitative research with JCD, and some folks will do what we call a qualitative data analysis, where they're looking at themes, but they really haven't connected the themes to the process, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so they're using just basically the data analysis piece of it. They're not using the whole method. And so what we're going to talk about today is the entire method. We won't be able to tell you exactly how to do it, but we're going to share with you the basic tenets of the method. So when do we use it? So again, it's when you really don't know a lot about what you're studying. So you know there's something going on, there's a phenomenon happening, and there's little to no research on it. That makes it a challenge in some different ways, but you want to say, what is this and how does it happen? So you're really thinking about the development or the process of something. And so you're again trying to explain it, and the theory that's going to come out of the information that you collect and analyze will do that. So there's an inherent process that's embedded in the research situation, and that process is going to come out when you use grounded theory methods. So there's the theories that typically underpin the theory making are social constructionist and constructivist. And so knowing that you do not know the truth, that you know, that is within the eye of the beholder, which in this case is the eye of the participant or the mouth of the participant, basically, in their experience. And sometimes that is, and a lot of times I would be biased in saying, a lot of times that meaning making is constructed around the social pieces of our society and of our different ways of being. So this is a great graph or diagram in the Charmet's text, and I would really encourage you to grab that. I'm not getting a kickback from that endorsement, but it basically is an overall picture of the process. And you see at the bottom on your left-hand side where it says research question, that bottom rectangle, that's really where you start. And you go all the way up through the whole process of writing. To the left, you see memo writing, which is one way that we keep ourselves honest in this process. It also helps us because memo writing is like note-taking in the process. And so you can go back to that and see where you're at in the process. To the right, though, you get into how you're sampling and analyzing. We're going to talk about that in a bit, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But this is a great diagram to display that.
So after taking a look at that overview, we're going to now go into specific steps and try to give you ideas that you want to be aware of as you're constructing a study or as you're considering putting a study together using grounded theory. So the very first step in the process is identifying the research question. How you design that research question, as in all research, how you design that research question needs to be tailored specifically to the methodology that you're considering using. In our study that we did on professional identity development, a grounded theory of transformational tasks of new counselors that was published in 2010, Our research question specifically was, what is the professional identity development of master's level counseling students from entry into the program through completion of the internship? Now, one of the things that we wanted to point out about this research question, and the reason that we believed that grounded theory was the appropriate methodology, is that we were looking to identify a process. So this process is the theory that evolved out of the data. So the considerations when you are designing a grounded theory study is you want to make sure that the question is what and how. Those are the key questions related to grounded theory. If we were to phrase this question in another way, let's say, for example, what is the relationship between between professional identity and leadership, for example? That is a very different question that would not lend itself necessarily to grounded theory. The key here is that we wanted to make sure that in the research question, as well as our methodology, that our examination of this process was clear.
So we start with sampling. I mean, let's say you know sort of the ideas that you wanted to explain. And so for our piece was professional identity development, and we were looking for we called them new counselors in the end, but we were really looking at students and counselor education programs, which are new counselors. And so we have to think about, okay, who are these people going to be, and how are we going to get to process or development? And we thought, you know what, we're probably going to have to look at students at different parts of their program. And you can do this without doing the what I think of a cross section of students. You could do it longitudinally, but we knew that was going to take a while, and we would have attrition. And you could still do it that way. That study is still out there waiting to be done. But you know, that was a specific sample that we needed to get. So we're looking at purposive. And so that's a purposive sample, and that's what you tend to look at when you're looking at these phenomenons and the specific people in specific contexts to which you want to examine. You can also have a modified random sample of individuals. You can also do snowball. It depends on what you're studying. Sometimes snowball gets a bad rap, but sometimes that's the way you have to find folks because of another person who is in that specific situation. They get the word out and carries on. So it really depends on what you're studying and how specific that population is to sample. So think about these things. What do you seek to know? What might you need to learn? How can interviews inform these questions as far as informing the questions about who you're going to go after? How will you develop your interview questions and skills to minimize preconceiving the data? How do you intend to use grounded theory methods to shape your interview study? So looking at the number of interviews depends on the analytic level to which the researcher aspires, as well as these purposes. So sometimes we get into, well, you know, how many interviews are necessary? And it's funny because, again, as an associate editor, I see a lot of different things come in, but I also have been on that end of submitting things and having reviews done on my own work. People have lots of different opinions about how many interviews. And so I think the main thing that you would see in the literature about interviewing itself, and we're going to talk about that, but interviewing itself, it's got to be in depth. You can't just have a 10-minute interview. The only way I would say a 10-minute interview was going to help is if it informs you of the next interview you need to do with the same people. So it really depends on the level, the analytic level to which you're going to do it. Colette and I have done a lot of studies together, and done pretty well with using one interview, but most of the time that one interview is anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. We've been fortunate with the people that we've been able to have as participants. But I've also known people to do several interviews, just depending on the nature of what they're studying and maybe how the first interview went. There may be a need for a lot of follow-up. So I can't tell you that one is going to be, getting the job done. I can't tell you five will. So it will really depend on how you have structured your process. So for us, we were recruiting. We were the lead researchers, and we were looking at universities that had some diversity related to the region in that particular study that we did. So we had some participants from the Southeast, we had some from the Midwest. And looking at the professional focus of the students, we actually had 3 different areas of counseling prep that we were including in the study. And so there were some limitations to that related to the diversity related to ethnicity. And what that means for, what we say a professional identity development means that we don't capture everything in that study related to professional identity development. So I think that those are things to consider when you're looking at sampling.
So the next step, once you've had an opportunity to identify what your plan is for your sample, then you're going to start designing your data collection strategy. What you're looking to identify, whether that's through individual interviews or focus groups or examining documents or other artifacts, is what is going on in their own words, in their own terminology, in their space, hopefully using respectful language that is inclusive and is built to be respectful. If you are going to be looking at the use of focus groups, which is what we decided to do for this study, we had to be aware of the power differential. We had to be aware of the fact that we were professors in those programs. However, they were students who were past our particular courses, so they had progressed beyond our courses, therefore would not be coming into our courses. We were aware of those things. You want to be aware of whether or not the small groups are pre-established, whether there's a recent history between them, whether you would like to use a moderator, and whether or not there is adequate assurance of confidentiality. On the next slide, some additional ideas about data collection relative to interviews. I think it's really important to understand that interviews within a grounded theory tradition are gently guided. And I know that people often are not sure what it means to have a semi-structured interview approach. But it's really important to understand that your questions need to be open-ended. We're going to talk about questions in a moment. But the idea is to allow their voice to emerge, not to, and one of the biggest mistakes is to ask your research question of your participants. That is definitely not what you want to do. You want to, through the literature, understand what are the major areas, topics, what are the major pre-established conclusions, and perhaps try to frame some of your questions around that. Now, in a pure guided theory, a grounded theory approach, you're going into this conversation with your participants with as much of an open mind as possible, so that you're not imposing prior literature and prior findings, but asking about those topics makes sense. All of your questions are open-ended. You want to make sure your research protocol is succinct, so that you're not asking 25 questions and trying to get at 25 different topics. So your questions need to be focused. They need to be grounded in some rationale for why are you asking this. They need to be open-ended. They need to be more "tell me about" versus what is this? What is your identity? This kind of thing. It needs to be much more applicable so that your participants can understand why you're asking these questions. It is appropriate to consider practicing this. We have, Donna and I have used expert readers. We've had persons who fit the description of our participants, but who are not the participants, to read the questions, go through them, and ask, is there anything that's not clear? Or is there anything that's confusing about these questions? So that you can get an idea of whether or not sensitive topics are being approached appropriately, and that you're using the language that your participants use. On the next slide, this is designed to give you some of the issues that you want to consider as you are going through, as you are designing your questions. So you want to make sure that your participants are able to, in their own words, share their views, concerns, and accounts. They want to make sure that you're not imposing your interests and your predetermined conclusions, so that you're not skewing the results in a direction that you want to somehow verify. Making sure that the conversation is two-sided. What that means is when your respondents give you information, you don't just go, and ask the next question, but just as in a counseling interview, you acknowledge, perhaps restate, or perhaps clarify, synthesize what they've shared with you so that you're taking them further. I sometimes am reminded of person-centered counseling and in terms of the response and elicitation of additional information from the participants in the study. You do want to provide significant or sufficient information. I think it's a good idea to send the interview questions to the participants before the interview so that they have a chance to read through it, to think about how they would like to respond. It gives them an opportunity, I think, to go a little bit deeper with their responses to you, and to provide richer examples of their responses. The questions here, I think, will give you a really good way to review, once you've designed your protocol, a really good way to review and revisit all of your questions critically in order to see that you are giving them the opportunity to teach you, to really inform you about what their experience is of the process under examination. And finally, the next next slide gives, that's it, thank you. This slide is a list of the questions that we asked our participants in our 2010 study. If we were to go back and revisit these, perhaps we would find some that we would phrase differently or would examine in a different way. But basically, what we were trying to do, as you can see, is stand back from the subject and not say, here's what professional identity is and here's how we expect you to experience professional identity, but we were asking them. Now remember, this was our study that we did with students currently in the program. So we were interested in, the source of their authority, who were the voices of who informed their vision of counseling. We wanted to know where they were currently, in their own words, in their professional identity development. And we wanted to give them an opportunity to kind of reflect on what they might need in order to move forward in their professional identity. So it was a past, present, and future kind of vision we hoped would elicit their thinking about their own evolution.
Great. And I just wanted to add on that I've been a participant of a grounded theory study or 2 or 3, I can't even remember now. And I think when they're done the way Colette's talking about with the person-centered kind of foundation to it, I mean, you really do feel good in that. And there have been times I've been moved to tears because of the specific topic, not because of how beautiful the research was going. It was just more of the topic and how they were responding to me. And it was almost like something I had to work through even through the interview. So I think we talk about grounded theory and a lot of qualitative methods where, you know, the researcher is, you know, part of, you know, you're the instrument and you're affected by the study and how it goes as well in the moment. And that's a really rich experience. But they're also in that experience, and I think that's why it's really just a cool thing to be a part of. And there's just a privilege when people agree to be a part of your study. So with all that being said, I'm going to talk about data analysis. I do apologize to my mentor, Jane Myers, who would say, "Don't crowd that slide, Donna," but we did, and it's because there's so much going on in data analysis. Whether it's quantitative or qualitative, it just seems to be so complex with qualitative. But I want to tell you and reassure you that there is some flexibility in analyzing data in qualitative methods and with specifically grounded theory. There are too many times I see where people think there is just a certain way you have to do this. Colette was sharing that she has someone that is going through a qualitative method. It's not her she's not the lead person on it, but she's, you know, she's saying that the methodologist is saying we have to do every one of these things, meaning word by word coding, line by line, incident by, you know, you don't have to do it that way. You know, you can do it the way that is most appropriate for your study. What I have listed here, the initial coding practices, and this is when you have your transcripts of the interviews and you decide, and I do encourage you, by the way, not to do it by yourself. I think it's a much richer experience, and I think your data gets analyzed to another level when you have a coding team. Sometimes that may mean just 2, but I would try to get a 3rd person in there if you can. And take a piece of this. First interview out, you take it and you decide, well, we're going to do that. We need to do this because of the type of research we're doing. We need to do this word by word or line by line or incident by with incident. It just depends on what you're studying. I know I say it depends a lot, but it does. So this, we tend to, when we do studies together, Colette and I, we do a lot of line by line, but sometimes there are things that pop up that it's incident by incident, like we're seeing this repeat itself, this certain thing sort of came up for our participants. And so we start comparing those similar incidents with each other, across each other. And so that's one way to do that. The other piece of this is to what we call constant comparative methods. And so you're trying to make comparisons at each level of analytic work. And again, it could be the incident by incident, or it could be the line by line. So you're always looking at similarities and differences within the data. So, for example, compare interview statements and incidents with the same interview in different interviews, earlier and later interviews. So again, it may make a difference that you're looking at, and in our study, the 2010 study, this came up. We're looking at, you know, specific time frames for folks. They had this certain incident, and we looked at what they were doing with it at the beginning of their program versus the end of the program. And so those constant comparisons where the data is evolving from. There's also in vivo codes, And that's where there's some special terminology that shows up. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to use this special language every time, but somebody may describe something that's happened. And we had this happen in another study. They described this this particular, it was almost like a mentoring relationship, but it was a very different type. And they described it that way. And so it popped up again in other participants' reports, but they didn't call it a certain thing, but we really hung on to some of that terminology. So sometimes you'll have that special term show up. There also could be some cultural pieces around that to be aware of. So that's something to think about. Going on beyond the initial coding, we look at focus coding. So you've done your first layer of coding, and so they may have some codes that appear more frequently among the initial codes or have more significance. And so we're going to use those codes almost like categories of things. And so we start piecing those together across participants, and it helps us to sift through all of the data. And that can help you code your initial codes that you have. So then in the end, you have these sort of categories of codes that have come out in the second layer of coding. And then we get to axial coding. And that's when we relate the categories to subcategories of codes. So it is complex, and there's no good way to show you or demonstrate that right now. But it helps us to answer those when, where, why, who, how, and with what consequences questions of the phenomenon that we're looking at. I'm going to show you a quick example. I know we're getting close on our time. But this was the model that came out of the 2010 study. If you look to the left side, if you're looking straight at this figure, look at the left side where you see definition of counseling, responsibility for professional growth, transformation to systemic identity. Those actually ended up being probably what you would consider the larger categories or themes from our data. And then across the top and across the front, you see a couple of different things. So what happens, you start seeing the process or the development across time, and that's why we have that time arrow at the bottom. But we see how the process relates to the themes, and I think that's what a lot of people forget in analyzing data for grounded theory, is you have to explain the process of the themes. You can't just tell me what the themes are. And you can't just say, well, across time they look differently. You got to tell me how they look differently. And so at the top, when we had people define counseling, if you remember from the list of interview questions that Colette showed you, everybody defined counseling. But remember, we were asking people who had just started the program, that were in the middle of the program, and that were finishing their program. And we saw that their definition changed. So it looked like it was mirroring expert opinions at the beginning, like they were really counting on, book definitions of counseling, some really formal definitions of counseling, all the way to, at the end, they had their own personalized definition of counseling, which was a really cool thing to hear about. We saw a similar thing going on across these three different themes, and it was the need for external validation to begin with, and it worked across to self-validation at the end of their program. And so we thought, okay, so that's explaining what we're seeing. It's not only just time, it's these three different things that were going on. External validation at the beginning, coursework experience, and commitment was happening in the middle to self-validation at the end. And so with grounded theory, you will see that an illustrative model usually occurs and usually is asked for when you're publishing. And so just put a couple of bullets up here about why that's important. It's good to visually represent the component parts of the grounded theory. Again, those were the component parts, but my writing had to explain the process and how those two things link together. How did my process explain the themes? How did the themes explain the process? So that is absolutely necessary.
Folks, we have about 5 minutes left.
And so you look at, great, thank you. So the considerations to this is type of learning styles that readers bring to their assessment of your work. I'm a visual person, so this helps a lot. And Colette and I could really share with you how this cube was in my head and I really couldn't get it out. And so we had a doc student, I believe at the time, to help us really figure this out. But it was stuck in my head the way all the pieces were coming together to explain that. And then look at labels and lines and arrows and what's too much. Sometimes we can have too much in a visual model. And focus on the abstraction, logic, and flow of it. Is it just there and you can't really make, even with the written explanation, you really can't understand the figure. So the figure should be somewhat self-explanatory, but you should be able to enhance it with the writing.
And just briefly wanted to talk a little bit about software. There are a number of software packages out there, some of which have some elements, some qualities that could be very useful in helping you manage the large amounts of data that may be generated during grounded theory with multiple interviews. For example, I've done a number of studies where, having up to 20 people, an hour for each, or 90 minutes, and that's a lot of data. So some software programs like NVivo might allow you to manage that very effectively, and especially if you're looking at word counts and doing keyword searches. And sometimes editors seem to like that. But there are some distinct disadvantages also. And so I personally prefer to do the by hand kind of coding because I would rather be the one to pull the nuances of language, to be able to understand when a participant is using evocative language and has expressed a lot of emotion. These systems may also be very expensive. And then on the final slide, in terms of reporting, one of the things I'd wanted to mention, both Donna and I having experience with editing and serving with as editors for CES, JCD, etc. The manuscripts for qualitative research in and of themselves are longer, and manuscripts for grounded theory are some of the longest. So it really is important to know what journal you're targeting, and to be able to provide these thick, rich descriptions, really important, but also know that to streamline direct quotes so that you're providing the most essential part of the description of your participants. And so that, I think that is pretty much, you can read the rest. I don't want to run us out of time. The last page is are the resources, so you'll be able to refer to those. I personally really enjoy Kathy Sharma's and have really enjoyed both her first and second editions.
I agree with that. And I mean, and we're fortunate we have so many good grounded theory manuscripts making it into our journals, and so we've been very fortunate. And I just highlight something that Colette was talking about with the longer manuscripts. She and I both have had to go to bat for getting more pages. That doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes you can cut and cut and cut that until it's really nothing. It's like a shade of what you have, and it's really hard to cut the voices and all that great material that people provided, and you don't want to lose that. So sometimes it's advocating for the research to be included in the journals with these page limits. And I think that's all we had. So I guess we're open to questions if you folks have them. I'm going to end our show.
Thank you both so much. This was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation greatly. To kick off here, I have a question from Abby that kind of points back to the beginning of your presentation when you were using that illustrative study. And she was curious about, first, were the questions used for the study listed in the article? Was that something that you all were asked to publish as part of the article?
One of the things that's really important with grounded theory, with any qualitative study, but especially with grounded theory, is you need to provide the questions either in kind of a succinct summary or in an actual appendix. And in this study, in the 2010 study, it was actually included as an appendix and published with the results. So one way or another, either summarized in your manuscript or appended at the end if you have enough pages. And in this study, we had enough pages.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic to hear, because the pages are hard, as you all were saying, and trying to get those questions in can be very difficult.
Yes. It really depends on the journal too. So, I mean, for me, as an associate editor, I really like to see those interview questions, because that gives me insight sometimes into how things have been analyzed or reported. And sometimes things need to go back and reanalyze, because the names on things, how they're reported, are representing the questions. And I think we might go to another level of analysis with this, and that doesn't mean you're not going to get published. It just might mean you need to do a heavy revise and resubmit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. She had a second question connected to this study. She was curious about, how do you address confidentiality in focus groups?
It's almost like groups, like group counseling. You can't guarantee it. You really encourage it. We haven't used focus groups a lot, and there's a great book too on focus groups. I'm not sure I added it. Yeah, it's down there, the Kruger and Casey book, and that's the use of focus groups for lots of different types of methodologies. But you know, we guarantee confidentiality on our end of it. We say, you know, we can't say that your focus group member is not going to disclose, but I would say probably, and that was that first study we used them with, I didn't hear a peep unless they talked to each other, and I didn't really hear any rumblings from that. I did not do the focus group interviews. That was one of the things I did, was, you know, because I was a professor there, and I said, no, I'm not doing the focus group interviews. Somebody else did those, and there was confidentiality with that person because they were part of the research team. So I never knew who had said what in the focus group itself, and I think that's important.
Great, thank you. Question from Melissa. She says, can you discuss the benefits or drawbacks of homogeneous versus heterogeneous samples when doing grounded theory research? If your first recruitment gets you a homogeneous sample, is it appropriate to use theoretical sampling to diversify your sample? Oh, my chat just popped when I was doing that. Oops. Yeah, there we go. I'm going to start that again. If your first recruitment gets you a homogeneous sample, is it appropriate to use theoretical sampling to diversify your sample in a second round of data collection after you've started coding?
And because you're using continuous comparative evaluation, you're always coding right after you collect your data. One of the things about qualitative research is that we're not striving to make generalized statements about this. The advantage of a heterogeneous group is that the reader then has the ability to understand that there is a wide range of responses that are being collapsed down into the grounded theory. That helps, I think, to increase their confidence that the results are valid. But we're not trying to generalize the results. So if you if your first call for recruits yields a homogeneous grouping, go on ahead and start collecting your data and then put out more calls for more participants. One of the things that I did in one study is it gave me an opportunity to compare in this particular sample, it was a racially homogeneous group and then a more diverse group, and it gave me the opportunity to examine both data sets and be able to look at whether or not there were significant differences in terms of the theory that eventually evolved, and there wasn't. So it was a nice way to sort of provide some confirmatory confidence. Yeah, there's a lot there, but yes, I think it would be appropriate. Donna, what do you think?
I agree with all of that. That's, I would say, first call, and you've already analyzed those demographic pieces of it, but go ahead and start interviewing and then put another call out, and that tells you something too. If you're putting a call out and it tells you several somethings, but if you put a call out and you continue to get a homogeneous group or participants, then do you need to do something different about your call or how you're doing that call? Or is somehow this topic, the phenomenon that you're trying to explain, is speaking to a specific, whether it's a cultural aspect or, whatever it is, something to talk about, because if you continue to get that and you do go ahead and do your study with all of the participants being in a homogeneous group, then you definitely will have to talk about that. And there's something to be said about that. But you can put all the efforts, but really examine, how you're making those calls and for recruitment.
Thank you. Connected to the sampling question, I wanted to ask a question to follow up about modified random sampling, because I don't think that this is something I ever learned about linked to grounded theory when I took my qualitative grounded theory course. So would you say something about how that looks in grounded theory?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of the question?
If, for example,
part of the question, I just didn't hear what you said.
Oh, modified random sampling in grounded theory.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think as long as, in terms of the modified random sample, as long as all of the persons in that sample from which you're drawing, as long as they all meet the criteria, I don't see that as being contrary to grounded theory approaches. I think it becomes a problem if the persons in that random pool don't fit the specific criteria that you're hoping to examine. That's when I think that methodology would be inappropriate, or that approach.
It sounds sort of, it's not a strict quantitative application to qualitative, in that you could have a lot of people that meet the criteria for a specific context. That is the key. So like Colette said, you can have everybody meeting the right criteria, but you don't need all of those folks. Let's say you had 50, and you don't need all of them for this study. I know there's a lot of saying, well, how many do you need? And and so that, there's some different thoughts about that as well. Again, I'm just going to throw it back to a saturation data point. And so it's saturation data point on explaining the process. And it's not just the themes. It's not the categories of themes that you're getting saturated on. It's the saturation on the process of those themes. And so again, there's the distinction when you start thinking about phenomenology, where you hear saturation and this magic number of either 7, 8 to 10, whatever it is. But I always go back to saturation. So with that, it's a saturation on the data and the themes. Here it's a saturation on the process. And so how much is that going to take?
Process.
It depends on what you're studying. I know I'm going to be the depends on kind of person here today.
Right.
I'm usually that person in the classroom, so no offense from this end. Well, I think we have time for one more question here from Nancy. She states, considering the context of grounded theory methodology, what advice and recommendations do you have when beginning a study or research topic with little to no prior literature available?
Well,
well, that's the best place to be. That's where you've got the most fun.
You're talking to two people who we drink the Kool-Aid on grounded theory, and I think Colette, and I'll share. Colette and I sort of grew up together with grounded theory, so learning about it, doing it, learning from mistakes. There were times when we thought we had something and we had to start over, and that became the start over became grounded theory. So I think that you always start with the question. What is the research question? What are you interested in? What hasn't been explained? And make sure you got that right, because that's going to drive everything else. And then the purist of grounded theorists would say you start so blind in this process that you wouldn't even be looking at literature necessarily. I don't actually recommend that. Colette wasn't actually recommending that a while ago either. I think you do have to do some background on this, what you could be guessing at, what you could be looking at. But let's say professional identity. We were interested in professional identity development. So guess where we had to go? We had to go look at existing information about professional identity and identity development. There's more stuff out there about professional identity versus professional identity development. So you start there after you have your research question. And then you'll start building, what group. You probably have an idea of what group you're wanting to have as participants. Make sure there's nothing out there with those participants. And then you would start developing some interview questions and how are you going to recruit these folks. So all of that starts coming together at that point. Any other ideas, Colette?
No, I think you kind of wrapped it up. The only other thing I would mention is that if there is absolutely nothing out there, then perhaps a person is starting with a phenomenological study if you don't even have a clear definition of the construct you want to examine. So perhaps that would be a first step, would be a phenomenological study, and then a grounded theory study to follow up in order to understand whatever process might exist around that construct.
Point. I've had a lot of doc students who, they'll find out that I do a lot of grounded theory. I don't make them read it, but they'll find out I've done a lot of grounded theory, and so they start shaping up whether it's their dissertation question or a different study question, and they want to jump to that, and I'm like, what do you know? And a lot of times we've had to go back to phenomenology because there's nothing out there on what they want, and that's a great place to be for a doc student. So,
well, and I think you all, as we're kind of wrapping this up, bring up the age-old question of choosing, the right methodology for your question, which is where we began this today. And I think that's a really nice place to be coming together here, because as we know, the divides of grounded theory of do you look at the literature or not has torn apart relationships within the grounded theory community. So the fun things we all learn in our doctoral level courses. This has been an absolutely fantastic day here together. Emily's going to go ahead and wrap us up with a few words about our next session.
Yes, I echo those thoughts, Jen Cook. Thank you all so much, Donna and Colette. wonderful presentation. I appreciate how user-friendly it was, and it's given me some good food for thought, and we've gotten really excellent feedback from the folks on the chat as well. So thank you again for your time and your expertise. And thank you everyone for attending. In terms of a couple last-minute housekeeping pieces here, I put some information in our chat that you can see. First of all, you are able to download the files directly here from our Adobe Connect meeting, the PDF of the PowerPoint from today, as well as you can also find it later on the website, and that should be up in the next couple days. Our next meeting is April 18th. That will be Drs. Melissa Luke and Christopher Goodrich. We'll talk about strategies for writing and publishing in counselor ed journals, qualitative research, obviously. So please look for that in April. We also are planning to meet in April at the ACA conference in Atlanta, Georgia. Hope to see you there. This will be a relatively informal meeting, ways to network and connect in person, since we're doing a lot of our meeting online, such as this. So please attend if you're able. 12:45 in the ACES suite, and we'll be sending out more information on that. And lastly, please do check out our website. We are trying to grow our social media presence and look for more that will be coming on that in the coming months. But that's it. Thank you again for attending. We had almost 40 folks here in total. So thanks for your participation and interest. And please be in touch with Jen or myself if you have more questions about CEQUIN or if you would like to get involved. So that's it. Again, Colette and Donna, thank you so much. This was tremendous. And have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.